Alright, let's get a couple of ground rules out of the way here really quick I've been meaning to talk about. For the past some time now, I've been debating trying to, for lack of a better way to put it, increase my production values on my little show here. And I'll spare you the lengthy discussion that I've been having with myself about it. The bottom line is I've decided not to. The main reason, and the primary reason for that, is simply because I don't have the time. Even as is now, I have a very difficult time squeezing these reviews into my daily existence, and especially given how much time and thought I put into my game reviews, it's just not really feasible for me to then pick up something else and say, okay, let's do this. I would like to start branching out a little bit, doing reviews in someplace other than, here. The library was an excellent idea. Several people tossed out. Apparently, they do rent out rooms for the library, although there's quite a waiting list, so who knows. Either way, I just wanted to apologize because I would like to do something more than just be a talking head, but A, I simply don't have the time, and B, I'm not really sure what I'd do with it, to be honest with you. So, moving along a bit. Let's talk about Final Fantasy X. Now, when we talk about Final Fantasies, as I mentioned before, a lot of people have a tendency to specifically think of one or the other. That is to say, they tend to think of the one they usually entered the series on, if that makes any sense. Excuse me. And as a resultant thereof, a lot of people tend to think of 10. It's actually amusing to me in its own strange way that Final Fantasy X is for several people I know personally the first Final Fantasy they played, and that always colors someone's impressions for obvious reasons. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But it's interesting to me because, then they go back and they're like, these are nothing like this. FF10, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the new guards. Final Fantasy. It's pretty much decisively the new guard at this point. There are still some people working on it that were on the old FF team, but this is decisively a Square Enix game at this point. And again, I'm not necessarily saying there's anything wrong with that. Indeed, this was their chance to really branch out and either decide to adhere to the themes and the tones and the specific type of style that the old FFs were, or to branch out and do something completely new on their own. Now, FF10 did branch out quite a bit. One of the bigger things we tend to notice is that it has a very oriental feel. Again, not in a bad way, but the music, the art style, the concept of the tradition and the culture are much more oriental than they are the standard medieval Western setting, basically, that Final Fantasies tend to have in the past. So there is that to consider. There is also, well, let me just lay this all out there right at the bat. I have said before that the worst kind of game, as far as on the scale, the worst game I'll review is one that's good. A good game, in my opinion, if I call a game good, that is the least good it can be before it officially is bad. I can enjoy the game. Usually popcorn games like Dragon Age 2 are a good example for that sort of thing. Something I do enjoy, but has obvious flaws, and, I'm with it. FF10 is not a good game. FF10 is above that. But I have already been asked this several times. Do I consider FF10 a work of art, one of the art category? No, I do not. And I will try to go into many of the reasons why as I'm going throughout this review, but FF10 is the next highest on the slot of the ones I haven't reviewed yet. That would be its sixth favorite Final Fantasy for anyone who's wondering. Up to the specifics, excuse me. And there's two very large reasons for that, which I'm going to cover very briefly here, and then I'm going to expound upon. Number one is Final Fantasy X had a very severe problem with weird for weirdness sakes. This is something that has cropped up before in the Final Fantasy series, but generally not very much so. And admittedly, this is a bit of an impression on my part, but a lot of times when games or animes or movies or TV shows or books or any medium really. When any medium tries to go for what I call weird for weirdness sakes, they're usually doing it in an attempt to be cerebral. Is a word I like to hear to defend that. And a lot of times I feel like that word is being used to defend it because they didn't, ironically, think about it, and they didn't know what to put here, so they wanted to put something flashy. Which, in my opinion, would be the opposite of cerebral, but let's just move on. FF10, in my opinion, did have a real problem with weird for weird's sake. There's too much stuff in the tone and the setting and in the art design especially that is just weird for weird's sakes and doesn't make any sense, doesn't actually add anything to it. And I'll go into that in detail later. The second thing that I feel hampers the story is ironically also one of its strengths. But it's one of those things, and I've talked about this kind of thing before, where there's something that if you pull it off well, it's awesome. But if you don't pull it off well, it's terrible. And hitting that balance point is a very difficult thing to do. What we had in Final Fantasy X is a player surrogate, and that would be Tidus, obviously. And I'm going to go into that more detail later, but suffice it to say, I think that could have been a strength, and indeed technically is a strength, but in the long term serves to the detriment of the story as a whole. Now, let me take a few steps back here. Oh my goodness. And let's talk about the gameplay for a bit here, shall we? Now, FF10 was the first Final Fantasy to actually have, honest-to-goodness, voice acting. Yeah, awesome. I'm with it. That was a great idea. We see the strange dichotomy, the strange binary nature of voice acting within Square Enix, within this game, because voice acting in Square Enix games, tends to be literally one of two things, often both, within the same game. Really, really good, and really, really bad. and, And it's sometimes it's within the same actor. The actor will do this game as this character really well, and then the next game he's doing the same character. It's the same actor, and it's just awful. You don't even understand what the hell he's going with that there. Cloud in Final Fantasy VII and Advent Children, and then in Dissidia is an excellent example of what I'm talking about there. Kingdom Hearts 2, which I guess was the first time he did that. But anyways, let's move on. Voice acting overall, net positive, I think, net benefit. I do enjoy voice acting within video games. Admittedly, video games have long since had a problem with voice acting because, in general, it was considered to be not respectable is the word I want to use here, not a respectable medium for voice actors in general. That has been changing pretty much steadily for the last 10 years plus, and you do see a lot more video games now, and indeed have over the last 10 years, that have genuinely good voice acting. So, bottom line here, I like hearing a story in addition to just reading it. Obviously FF10 is not 100% voice acting, and that's fine. There is still plenty of text to read, but I do enjoy the major cutscenes being spoken out loud. It adds something to the story, in my opinion, especially since there's a quality that video games sometimes have that I call the empty feature, which is when a scene that should be interesting or engaging isn't, because it feels so empty, because there's something missing. Sometimes it's music, sometimes it's voice acting, sometimes the voice acting is bad. But whatever it is, it feels half-hearted, if you know what I mean. Now, and so when you have a decent voice acting cast, or at the very least a moderately good voice acting cast, and you consistently have them saying the lines in every cutscene, that tends to offset that. And Final Fantasy X is definitely one of those. The voice acting, like I said, really was a good job. Excuse me. They got several decent voice actors, relatively well-known people. I suddenly can't think of his name. The guy who plays Waka is an excellent voice actor, and is probably, to be a little frank, the only reason I like Waka. I'll get into him later. But that decision, and this is important to note, was not one to be made lightly, because this was their first real foray into this. Yes, Kingdom Hearts came out before FF10, I think it did. I could be wrong about that. But this, and Dragon Quest VIII was also in that same general vicinity, but this was a big step, adding voice acting to the game. As much of a risk as it was, I think it was a good call, and I think that does add to the flavor of the game, and is one of the reasons why FF10 feels more cinematic than it would have otherwise. Now, one of the things they did that was very strange and was rather controversial among several people I discussed it with at the time was the combat system. For the first time since the old FFs, and when I say the old FFs I mean the ones on the NES, we had genuine turn-based combat. Now, the speed rating and the moves that affect this and add delay and all that can alter the turn rating, but for the first time since FF3, basically. Actually, it's been since FF1, hasn't it? Anyways, for the first time in a long time... No, FF2 had that as well. For the first time since the NES days, one way or another, we had genuine turn-based combat. When your turn comes up, you could put the controller down, go take a nap, have a shower, maybe eat a sandwich, The game's still sitting there waiting for you to make your move. And turn-based combat is always a completely different animal than real-time, active time battles. And I'm not saying it was a bad thing, quite the contrary. But it was an interesting move, and a lot of people were very confused by the rather sudden shift, especially since you get to see the turns all up there in the upper right. Now, I think that was actually a strength. When you have a system in-game that helps bring the player further into the moment, and really helps the battles flesh out a bit more. I think that's a positive right there. And I do just to use my personal experience here. On several occasions, I would look up there and see that I had a turn and Yuna had a turn, and then it was going to be the boss's turns 3 times in a row. And there was just this little bit of spark of dread, of nervousness, of, oh god, what's he going to do, you know? And how can I prepare for those 3 turns of me getting bombarded here? The fact that they let you see the turn thing was a good idea and adds to the atmosphere of the overall thing. The fact that it is turn-based, of course, takes away from the atmosphere technically. Technically. But overall, I think it did actually work in the series' favor. It was an interesting branch out. We'd been active time for the last 6 games, bare minimum, not counting, any branch offs or anything like that. And it was about time to try something new. So I'm with that, and it worked. And that's really important to note. It did work. It wasn't just pure turn-based like, say, FF1 was. There was a complexity to it and a system to it, and you should still work with it and still work through it and understand it. And so definitely an overall net plus on that one. Now, while I'm talking about combat, let's talk about the customization. I've talked about this issue in many of my Final Fantasy reviews, about the variance between true customization, which we're still not at, by the way, and true linearity, which Final Fantasy IV is probably the pinnacle of that as far as being done properly. And the FFs have been bouncing between these 2 lines for the entirety of the series. Now, FF10 is quite a ways over here, all things considered. Probably the furthest to the extreme, not counting the extreme itself. Did that work in its favor? Now, I've gone on record saying before, more than once actually, that I'm uncomfortable in this chair. Sorry, let me try and relax my back a bit. I'm getting old. It has been said, I've been saying more than once, that I prefer a degree of middle ground. I have said before that I think FF6 is probably the epitome, in my opinion, of the blend between the 2 systems, of having some linearity and some progression that is character-specific, and then also having the customization ability to tweak them as you wish. Now, I've discussed this issue at length in debate, but let's go ahead and talk about how FF10 approaches, because FF10 had a very interesting method here. If you know what you're doing, if you know what you're doing, and you put the time and effort into it, FF10 is, technically, full, true customization. You can turn Lulu into the most amazing melee fighter in the game. You can have her quick hitting for quint 9s every turn, and in fact I have a save game like that, just to use one example. You can also turn Waka, for example, into the primo mage who has all the spells and all the spirit ups, I believe was the stat. You know what I'm talking about, right? That is possible for you to do. Now, the catch here is, in order to do that, you have to, again, know what you're doing, and you have to actively seek it out. This is important. This is the key point of Final Fantasy X. The leveling system of the sphere grid was actually somewhat linear in the fact that it was guided. There's a reason that the grid is chunked up, so this is Riku's section, this is Auron's section, this is, Tidus' section, etc., etc., right? And the reasoning for that was so you had that guideline. So you knew this was the general path you followed. And if you didn't feel like customizing, if you didn't feel like tweaking, if you didn't feel like min-maxing, you didn't have to, because you could just follow the guideline, and at some point along the line, you would reach a point where you could keep going, and you'd get an unlock sphere, you'd unlock it, and you'd keep going. And so it is very possible, as weird as it sounds, to not customize at all, basically, in Final Fantasy X, and I know several people who've played it that way. And so you see, what we have here is a truly optional leveling system. You have the option to either be completely linear and follow the grid as it's dictated, to completely change the entire grid, with the exception of the abilities and a few key points, literally replacing every sphere with the optimized sphere of the right type and right style. You know what you're talking about. The min-max, absolutely max everything, max every stat, max everything on everybody. That is possible. And that's at this front end of the spectrum. And you can choose anywhere in between these two, wherever it is you want to let it. You want to customize a little bit, you want to branch out a little bit, you want to do the arena just for a couple of bosses and get a couple of spheres and go change this area and make her a little bit better. You can do that. And that was a brilliant decision on their part, and unfortunately it is one that has not been replicated since. FF13, frankly, was lackluster, and FF12 I'll talk about later. But it gave you that option, and on top of that, this ties into that, because the whole point I keep mentioning when it comes to customization, aside from the customization itself, which most gamers do enjoy, myself included, is the thought that it doesn't matter who I bring, which can be both a good and a bad thing. FF10 gets around that problem twice. First of all, the customization, like I just said. If you want your party to consist of Lulu and Waka and Auron. No, that's not my party. I was just thinking of characters at random, basically. Then you can do that. That's possible. Done. Boom. Set each one up as whatever you feel like, or set them up relatively, or however you want to do that. But there is still a little bit of work involved in there, but there is another way around that, and that other way around that is sheer brilliance. This is also the only FF that's really done this. You can swap party members in combat. You can actually say, you've got that setup, right? And well, you know what? I don't want Lulu to take her turn this time. Lulu, swap with Yuna. Done. And it doesn't. Now, this is important. It doesn't interrupt their order in the turn. That turn-based thing over here in the corner. I guess that'd be up here, wouldn't it? Doesn't move. They just switch. Instead of Lulu being at that spot, it's now Yuna at that spot. And that was a brilliant decision and really opened up, A, the availability for the developers to really up the complexity of the bosses and add different strategies to them, and B, to allow the player so much more tactical options when dealing with the combat. Excellent move, and I'm very much in favor of that. And I guess that's really all I have to say about that. But it was, and this is worth noting, because I want to praise FF10 in its own right. It is worth noting that was a risk, that was something that might be seen as bad, and indeed some people do see as bad. Some people dislike that thing, and they're entitled to their opinion, of course. But that's exactly my point. It was a risky maneuver, and it, in my opinion, paid off. Now I'm going to pause really quick, because I meant to say this at the beginning of the movie, but it has been, FF6, FF4, FF7, all of FF5, all of these games, I have genuinely and heartfeltly said, please go out and play this game before you watch this review. And I've had several people who have responded to me and said, yes, of course, we did that, and it was awesome. We're still in the process of doing that because, they're kind of long games. And do I recommend that for FF10? Because I've started getting that question. Should I say go play this game before watching this review? With FF10, I've basically already outlined everything you need to know to decide whether or not you'd like this game. Is the story engaging? Yes, no question. Is the story lacking in certain places? Yes, unfortunately. Does it have more of an Oriental feel? It has the Oriental feel, which can be good or bad depending on personal preference. It has the weird for weirdness sake problem. It has the problem of Tidus, the character. I'll get into that later. But overall, this is a very good game, and do I recommend it? Generally, overall, yes, I do. Not as strongly as the others, I'll admit that freely. This is not a game that I could say without question or hesitation, yes, go play this now. This is a game that I could say with like a 90% certainty, certitude? Yes, you will probably enjoy this. That's just my opinion, just getting it out there, but let's go ahead and continue here. Sorry for the delayed point there. Mini games. I talked about this way back in FF7, because 7, to rehash really briefly, was the first FF to really have genuine, no-really mini games. Everything before that had what, at the time, we referred to as mini games, but really aren't by today's standards. A mini game is something that is a whole other different system, whole other different thing, usually rather simple, and it's there for fun. Sometimes it'll get you prizes, sometimes it'll get you rewards, especially in an FF, but that kind of thing it's its own side category right here, and the FFs have been increasing in the amount of minigames they have over time. Now, I say that because ultimately FF7, while it started it with the Golden Saucer, if you really look back, didn't actually have that many minigames in it. Not really. It wasn't until FF9 that it started getting, FF10 has quite a few, but we're only going to talk about a couple of them. First one I'm going to talk about is dodging lightning. Now, Anybody who knows me to any degree or extent probably knows that I am something of a completionist. And most RPGs and games I play through, I try to do at least a 90% playthrough, as I call it, which is everything except for the insane stuff, which I generally don't do. And let me define that really quick. When I mean insane stuff, picture going through Final Fantasy VI and getting 99 of every item that it's possible to get 99 of. Now think about how long that would take and how much effort that would be involved. Because in my mind, that is 100%ing. Absolutely, no, really, 100%. Getting all the rages and getting all the lores and getting all the items at least one of, that's 90%ing. You follow me here? So I do try to 90% just about every game I go through. FF10 is no exception. FF10 I got a lot closer to 100%ing than most games, though. My save file on that is absolutely gargantuan. And I did min-max, sat down, there was no walkthrough or anything like the time. I mean, obviously there was the strategy guide, but I didn't have that. And just started writing down and exactly how to mathed out how to min-max the sphere grid in order to perfectly max everyone and blah blah blah. Did the arena. What am I getting to here? In all of that, in the mind-numbing amount of time I spent min-maxing that game and doing the Blitzball and doing the Chocobo and everything, I hated dodging the lightning. Because dodging the lightning is the perfect example, in my opinion, of how not to do a skill challenge in a game. If you have something that relies on reflexes, okay, the longer you make it, the more of a bastard you are. And I mean this sincerely, though. Let me take a step back. Let's not speak personally here. In all sincerity, if you have a skill challenge and you require the person to do that skill challenge multiple times, in general, there's this range of acceptability. You know, you don't want it to do just once. That's silly. You don't want to do it like 3 times. That's relatively easy. 10 times, in my opinion, is generally about the sweet spot. You do, dodging the lightning, I would probably go ahead and say actually 30 times, to be a little honest with you. 30 times, just enough to make sure we're paying attention and keep paying attention, and to make sure it's not a fluke, and to make sure that we are not getting too wired and missing the button press, basically, right? Make sense? 200 times is asinine. And all it does is punish you with absolute failure, by the way. This is a binary thing. 200 times or bust. So, you fail on lightning number 198. You get to start all over again. From 0. That is the worst kind of artificial lengthening of a challenge in a game, in my opinion. When you pad it out like that, all you're doing is frustrating the player. It is no longer about skill. It is no longer about patience. It is simple frustration, period, end of statement, and that was a bad design choice in my opinion. I'm sorry if people disagree with me. Yes, obviously I was very frustrated with it, but like I said, even stepping away from the personal side of this, that's bad game design. 30, 50 at the most. At the absolute most, I would say. Let me give you another example of this, if I might diverge for a second. Super Mario RPG has a reward for getting the best, it was like the best trinket in the game, or accessory, actually, it was called in that game. You got it by jumping on an enemy 100 times, okay? That's harder to do than it sounds. A lot harder to do than it sounds. My average jump time was about, or times jumped, I should say, it was probably more like 30. In that circumstance, again, 50 would probably be the high end, but I could still go with 50. But going past 50, the brain just starts to get... the repetition wears us down. It's just how that works. We're human beings. Repetition wears us down. And so most games know and understand that the best way to bypass this, the best way to bypass the worst kind of grind, which is identical grind, is to try and vary it a little bit. Try and give a little bit of a difference, even just a minor difference, even something alternating from fight to fight or from event to event. Just doing this 100 times and having to do it perfectly and timing it perfectly, and if you mess up, you have to start all over again. Not good game design. I'm sorry, guys. I know you all are crazy. But no. Now, I apologize for going off on that one, but I really felt it was worth noting because of the many things that FF10 did, it really did feel like a bad idea. Like someone thought, oh, this will be cute, or maybe it was implemented as a joke, like the Uhura fan dance, for example. But, and then they decided, oh, that's a great idea, let's go with that, and implement it in the game. And I just picture some developer somewhere going, what? let's move on. Let's talk about the arena. Now, I think the arena was relatively well implemented. I think it could have been streamlined a little bit better. It is also worth noting that the arena, let's be honest with ourselves, is basically endgame, or as most people call it, post-endgame. Obviously, post-endgame doesn't technically exist in Final Fantasy X, but there is a point at which you are ready to go fight Sin, and that's it. That's the only thing left. And so you go and do arena stuff at that point, if you're not trying to 90% the game, or indeed 100% the game. So you go to the arena and you do all this thing. Now, the first boss fights being gigantic scaling cliffs of doom in terms of difficulty, that doesn't actually bother me at all. It really doesn't, because I don't know if your experience is anywhere near like mine, but if you were ready, if you were at that point when you're ready to go fight those things initially, they're not impossible. But like I said, I do think it could have been streamlined a little bit better, because not impossible is still a little bit steep for most people. And now, granted that is kind of the point, admittedly, because part of the point of optional content like that, and what is usually considered post game, is to be the hard stuff. If you want something relatively easy, or if you want to be eased into it, then you're probably the wrong target audience for this. And I mean that with all due sincerity and no intent for insult, if you know what I mean. It's just fact. This optional stuff was designed for people, well, like me, to be honest with you. And I know I'm not alone in that. There are several people who want the hard stuff. They want to be challenged. They want to get their face ground into the grinder, and they want to have their nose down to a little bit of nub before they finally defeat the first boss. And they're like, yes, sir! However, when I refer to streamlining, I really should explain this, because I've said the term like 3 times now. The arena bosses got a little bit too grindy. In order to truly min-max the game, you have to face grind those arena bosses. Now, getting in there doesn't bother me that much. Getting the first few fights in doesn't bother me that much. Capturing all the creatures across the wild in order to unlock the arena bosses, that didn't bother me at all. That was actually a lot of fun. Reaching a point where you've defeated like the first 8 or 10, I think, something like that, arena bosses, and then you hit the real wall, which is, okay, now min-max on those bosses in order to be able to fight these bosses. That was a bit much. And it's not a bit much because the difficulty was the problem, it was a bit much because the grind was the problem. Again, FF10 seemed to be designed for a slightly different type of audience than what most of the FFs were used to. Go and grind was basically the message we were being told. And so we did, and we grinded our faces off and got completely min-maxed, so everyone was quint-hitting 99, quint-hitting 9s with quick hit. And then we went and destroyed the bosses like they were jokes, which I guess kind of emphasizes the problem here I have with this whole setup. I think the arena could have been better implemented. I think the bosses could have been more interesting in their challenge. They had the system in place, with the turn-based combat and with the ability to use unique manipulations and enemy overdrives and all that fun stuff. They could have done so many different things in order to make those unique boss fights and truly interesting boss fights, rather than just, he hits incredibly hard and he also does these 7 status effects. Ultimately, that's not that interesting. It was still fun. Let's make this absolutely clear. I still enjoyed the arena. I did. I still enjoyed going and destroying the heck out of Nemesis or Paragon or whichever one it was. I still enjoyed min-maxing all my guys. I will never do it again. And that's kind of my point. Optional content should not feel... This is also take over from the dodge lightning thing. Optional content like that should not feel like... It should not engender that feeling of, I don't want to do this again. I have done it. I'm moved on. When I go and replay FF7, I enjoy fighting Ruby. I enjoy fighting Emerald. When I go and replay... let's go and use Final Fantasy VI. When I go and replay Final Fantasy VI on the Advance, I love going through the Dragon Dungeon, the new one that they added in the Advance. And for that matter, I love going to the Dinosaur Forest as early as possible, just to see if I can fight the Brachiosaurs and the Tyrannosaurs at nothing level, because that is challenging. Optional challenge, I might add. But it's still fun. It's never grind. It's never just... Okay, kill Tyrannosaurs and kill Tyrannosaurs and kill Tyrannosaurs. Obviously, yes, that's how you level if you're trying to level, but you get my point. FF10 enforced grinding in order to get through there, and I don't want to do that again, So, like I said, net positive, but just barely on the arena. It was overall a good concept. I think it could have been tweaked a little bit better and implemented a little bit better in the ways that I discussed. Chocobo racing, which admittedly I don't have that much to say about. Because I remember how nightmarishly difficult it was to get that last thing. Now maybe it's just me. Maybe I sucked. But ultimately, as weird as this is going to sound, of the games that have had Chocobo Racing, which is a whopping 3, I believe, at this point, counting 13, I'm sorry, 13-2, uh, we've never had what I would actually want in a Chocobo race, which is a Chocobo race. In FF7, the Chocobo racing was fun enough, but it was also casual enough and quick enough, and that's important. The race was just like a minute and a half, boom, done. And you had so little control over your guy, and you had so little control of what he did, but that was okay because it was relatively quick and easy and fun. It still wasn't what I wanted. In FF10, again, it's not really a true race in the sense of, in any real sense of the word, and it would have been a lot funner, in my opinion, if they had actually implemented that. That being said, I have nothing else to say about the Chocobo Racing. Overall, an interesting little addendum. Now, there's a lot of other mini-games, that I'm not actually going to discuss here. There is one that I've been dodging around, that I'm sure people are just sitting over there waiting. Come on, is he going to talk about it? Blitzball. Now, I'm going to go ahead and go out on a limb here, because I know this is somewhat of a divisive topic. But I actually genuinely enjoyed Blitzball. There were times playing FF10, this has actually only happened twice, but hey, where I got to the point where you could truly do everything with the Blitzball, which is actually quite a ways into the game if I remember correctly. You know, when you can Blitzball for reals, kind of like Chocobo Racing for real back in FF7. And I would just kind of stop playing. And by that I would mean I would go Blitzball, and I would enjoy playing Blitzball and move my way up the ranks and train the people and get the right team and get the right squad and get him with this ability and this, and we'll go fight him. I actually rather enjoyed that minigame because it was actually elaborate enough that it never felt unnecessary, and the AI was always just on the other side of irritating. That it made it and when I say just on the other side, I mean they were in fact irritating, but they weren't too irritating. This is important. If they just irritate you a little or every now and again, that's okay. And the reason why is because that way, if they're only that far over, that means they're also not that difficult, relatively speaking, which means, in other words, that you will defeat them, at least if you try and learn the game and know what you're doing. And so you defeat them, and then you feel awesome, because those guys who are irritating the unholy heck out of you have just been muddied in the dirt, you know? Now, that being said, it is also worth noting that, unfortunately, in Blitzball, you could get to the point where your team just dominates everything, and it reaches a point where... I don't even know how to explain it properly. I'd liken it to Mike Tyson back when he was really in his prime. You know, what's the reason to go to those matches? To see him punch out another guy in 2 hits again? Because that is kind of how Blitzball gets if you really get good at it and you really pick your team properly. Now, of course, there are ways to challenge yourself in that, and several people have made up challenges for, you know, you have to stick with this team, you have to stick with these people, you can only use this type of abilities, you know, blah, 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 in order to increase the challenge, in order to make sure that you're always going to be challenged throughout the season, or whatever you want to call it. And I'm cool with that, and that's one of the reasons why I'm ultimately not going to list this as a negative, because you have to put forth the effort into making the game that easy to the point where it's boring. Now, you can do that if all you want to do is win the ball for Waka, get the item from the Blitzball in order for to get Waka's ultimate weapon. If that's all you're interested in, yeah, go for it. Just demolish the heck out of him. It's going to be a little grindy, because this is FF10. But it's still going to be, at least in my opinion, it's still going to be enjoyable to some extent or another. And if you don't want to do that, if you just want to go play Blitzball, then you can just go play Blitzball. And I like the fact that there was this whole mini-game that was mostly optional. Other than the Waka thing, for all intents and purposes, it was optional, and it was there just for fun. The last time I saw that implemented that well in an FF was FF8, with the card game, whose name I can't think of right now. Now, obviously, yes, in both cases you do get game rewards for doing the minigame, but for the most part, why did you go out and seek people to play cards against an FF8? Because it was fun. And I'm with that. Now, let's go ahead and talk about Final Fantasy X as far as story and concept. Let's talk about the themes. I've talked before about the fact that the more recent you get with the Final Fantasies, the more ingrained the theme concept tends to be in the game. FF10 is very strong in this respect. Very strong, to the point where it has been argued that there is in fact only one theme. I disagree, personally, but I think that is because the 2 themes that I see within the game are very clearly and intimately integrated one with another. The first theme, well, let's take a step back, actually. Let's talk about something else. I mentioned this way back at the beginning, that FF10 had a lot of potential, and in fact, in my completely personal opinion, Final Fantasy X had the potential to have the best storyline of the Final Fantasies, and I mean that sincerely. I think it was not executed properly enough. But what we had is all the makings of a truly engaging, epic, dramatic, character-driven, setting important, everything on every end of the scale, from personal to epic and back again, was there and was present. This is the Star Trek 3 of Final Fantasies, because they had all the pieces there. They just didn't quite implement it as well as I would have liked. Let me explain this by mentioning another game, because whenever I think of Final Fantasy X, my thoughts tend to turn towards another game, Breath of Fire 2. Now, if you really look at the bare bones of the two plots of the two games, they are very similar, right? Here's the catch. Breath of Fire 2 was done in a simpler age, and it was done at a time when the story was just becoming something that was popular and something that people wanted to put into games. So while there was actually quite an interesting story behind Breath of Fire 2, and one I enjoy to this day, it was ultimately not as in-depth or as dynamic as it could have been. The evil guys were very clearly, unequivocally evil. The evil church was an evil church, and you were the good guys and blah blah blah, right? Not saying that that's a complaint, by the way. I'm just highlighting it because Breath of Fire 2 was still an engaging story. It was the corrupt religion story, and that is a very hard story to pull off well. It really is, because religion for so many people, and with good reason, is a very sensitive subject. And so, pulling off a corrupt religion story takes real effort and work in order to actually have it come off well. And in Breath of Fire 2's case, what they did was they made it a religion that was extremely binary. I'm sorry, that's not really the word I want to use. Extremely two-faced, we'll go with that. Because the face they presented to the world was nice to the point of giving you cancer. I mean, not cancer, diabetes, there we go. Extremely nice, extremely caring. We will give without thought to ourselves. It was almost to a level of extremism as far as selflessness and giving. Now that's interesting, because what they actually are, in the second face over here, is the exact opposite of that. Truly, unutterably, unequivocally monsters. Monstrously evil. Not just bad guys, but monstrously, sadistically evil. Just sick people, right? And that worked for that. That worked for the setting, because then with these two faces and the way they were presenting, most people could relate to it, and at the same time, when they saw the twist, were like, oh, and it clicked in their minds, and it worked with them, and it never got personal enough to make them think that these were real-world analogous events, because a lot of people like to think events in fiction are, oh, well, you're just making fun of blah, which is something I personally find irritation with, but let's just move on from that. FF10 did something much riskier. FF10 has the evil church not actually being evil, has the good guys not really sure whether they're the good guys or not, and has everyone in between mostly ignorant of both. FF10 is a very gray setting overall, and it actually works very much in its favor. What we see... Now, I want to stress this, because this is the single most important part of Final Fantasy X, and a lot of people don't even think about this. A lot of the people just accept this as writ, but you really need to think this. Let this set in. I mean this, sincerely. We here in real life don't have anything that is the equivalent of this, which is why this is so hard to mentally calculate. Okay, so I'm sorry for the build-up, but seriously. Picture a culture, a society, a continent-wide society. Every life that you know in your whole world revolves around this one thing: sin. You are either under attack from him, recovering from an attack from him. I guess, actually, I'm sorry, I'm saying this a little bit wrong. You're either preparing for an attack from him, under attack from him, or recovering for attack from him. That is your entire life. I want you to think about that, seriously. Every day, every year, every month, every week, every second, every decade. This is your life, right here. Now, I want you to picture what that would do to a society. If we here in real life were under a circumstance where sin attacked us every few years or decade, because they mentioned several times that the time of the calms is variable, and sometimes it is a couple years, and I do mean just a couple, like 2 or 3. Sometimes it's more. The one just prior to the game is one of the longest in history, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, that was by design, but let's not get into that. Picture that, though. Seriously, picture that your entire life revolves around that. That you don't have the availability to enjoy life because all of your life is revolving around that problem. And the cracks, the 1%, is you trying to eke out your own little existence. Try and picture that for a moment. Try and understand the kind of lives these people lead. I've heard a lot of people express frustration at the quote-unquote stupidity of the denizens of Spira. To which I can only shake my head because, in my opinion, they all were acting exactly how they should. And I do mean all. Even the people who were outcast, even the Albed, still revolved their lives around sin. They did it in a different manner. They tried to use the machina, and they tried to advance their technology in the brief respites that they had available to them. And the whole reason that they had the opportunity to finally make a strike against sin was A, the corrupt church, and B, the fact that it had been one of the longest calms yet. But they were still caught in the spiral of death that is Final Fantasy X. And that is ultimately FF10 in a nutshell, Spira, the spiral of death. As Seymour himself, I believe, is the one who said that. I think Auron actually said that too, but anyways, moving on. Now, with that idea firmly in mind, try and picture a religion that genuinely believes, for the most part, that what they're doing is the best possible path. We're not talking about ill intent. We're not talking about evil, something so black as that. We're talking about people who think that continuing to maintain this spiral of death is the correct choice because it is the only choice. Because this, Yunalesca herself says it best, this false hope that they give is the only hope. And they believe that, genuinely, truly with their whole being, and indeed, for good reason. Because it has been hinted at, never actually stated outright, that there were times in the cycle where sin was not stopped immediately, and just kind of kept going. Just kind of kept ravaging until someone finally managed to do the final summoning and start the cycle over again. And so refusing to resist isn't an option, and attempting to stop the cycle isn't an option because, and this is the beautifully horrific part about it, society can't advance in 10 years. Not from their state. Our society has changed a lot in the last 10 years, but I want you to picture going back. Let's just go ahead and go back 110 years, give or take, okay? Beginnings of the 1900s. What was the societal difference between 1900 and 1910? How much did society change? Now, that's actually a pretty large topic, but let me just go into this really briefly. It did change, but it didn't change much. And that was in a society that wasn't worrying about constant threat or fear of sin attacking. And that's also on the outside, don't forget. That's the most period of time they'll have. Imagine a society trying to evolve, to grow, to better itself in 2 years or 5. It's not really feasible, is it, when you think about it? So their technology and their culture and their family values and society, everything that makes up a civilization, was utterly and completely stagnant because everything was just barely keeping up, treading water. And they knew, all of them that actually knew what was going on, all the members of the religion, Yunalesca, all the summoners who were involved, they knew that they were just barely treading water as is, and if they stopped or tried something else, they might sink below the water and they might not be able to catch back up. Understanding the true plight of the setting is very important to understanding the motivations of so many of the characters. So many of the members of Yevon, that was it, of the Church of Yevon, were doing what they felt was best, was the best it got, as bad as it was, and most of them acknowledged just how bad and horrible it was still as good as it got. And this was just how things were. And there was a level of acceptance there, a level of resignation is the word I want to use, that coats the entire game in this thick marmalade that you can just barely slog through, because it has covered every aspect of the lives. I apologize for going over and over about this, but this is really important. This is one of the reasons the game is so strong in its story element, because that backstory, when I first heard about it, when I first heard about FF10, hearing the backstory and about the cycle, I didn't even know all the details, but just knowing that, my brain was able to go, oh, and it assumed all the things that we now know are true. I could have been wrong, of course, but my point is, it engaged me like that. I was hooked, because that had so much potential, and indeed did manage to pull out a magnificent story out of it. But I'm sorry, I've kind of gone a little bit of a full circle here, or rather more like an arc. But getting back over here to the church thing, what we have here is a corrupt church, and they're only corrupt because we, the players, have a third-person perspective on the matter. We see them as corrupt because we have a society and a mindset and a life and emotional stability that says you can do more, you can do better. We know you can. We know you can. They have lived with this for longer than their great-great-grandparents have been alive. They don't know that. In fact, they have been so ground into the ground that I am amazed that society, if you could call it that, existed at all by the time FF10 came around. It is no wonder that the faith wanted to stop so badly. Yes, I know they wanted to stop for their own reasons. But my God, Now, in keeping with that, let's go ahead and just call it Gnosticism, not agnosticism, Gnosticism. I think I'm pronouncing that wrong. I apologize. All of this is what I've been talking about. Is this first theme, the theme of the religion, of the idea that this is, because there's one other theme that there's one other thing that I haven't mentioned in all of this. On top of all of this, everyone believes, because their fathers believed it, and their fathers believed it, and their fathers believed it, that this is what we deserve. That we deserve to have no life, to have no existence. That we deserve to survive, and that's it. That we deserve to struggle on day after day after day for a millennia, because we don't deserve any better. And that's actually a really powerful thought if you really think about it. Imagine an entire culture that is so steeped in that level of guilt and that level of self-wounding on an emotional scale, on a mental scale, and of course on a physical scale, because sin is literal. Sin actually walks around and smashes things. I'm sorry, that probably sounded funnier than I meant it to, but you see where I'm coming with on this. That theme of we deserve this, on top of the sheer dread and weight that bogs down that game, is one of the reasons, in my opinion, that FF10 is still a amazing game. Not just a good game, not even a great game. It is truly an amazing game, because that atmosphere is ever present. And we see it the perfect way. I'll get to that in a minute. But we do see this in the perfect way. Now I'm going to go ahead and pause there, because that's a good segue into the other theme. Now this theme is very tied in with it. This is what I consider to be the true strongest theme of Final Fantasy X, even though I actually went to look up what the official theme was considered, and it wasn't even listed there, so maybe I'm wrong. But in my interpretation, the strongest theme of Final Fantasy X is that of tradition. The idea that... I gotta pause for a second. I'm very non-traditionalist. I have my own little traditions, if you could even call them that, habits or things that I do because I like to do it. Comes to mind immediately. But I do that for a reason, if that makes any sense. And if it ever reached a point where that no longer made sense, or that was actively a silly thing or a stupid thing to do, I'd stop, because I'm not a traditionalist. I don't go for that. I go for what's good for now and what works for me and the people and the dynamic and blah, blah, blah. Dynamic, things aren't static in my mind. And so it makes more sense to me to be more fluid rather than more rigid, which is what tradition is. It's very rigid by most definition. Obviously not all. FF10 is probably the rigidest of traditions I've ever seen in my life. Everything I was just talking about is all tradition steeped in tradition. These people have been doing this for so many generations, and it's also worth noting they never state this outright, but it's very well implied that the severe death rate that happens on that world means we're talking about, I'm thinking 1400s here in real life as far as birth rate. And the only reason they were keeping up at all was because of the higher birth rate, because people were encouraged to marry and have kids young. And I get the very strong impression that despite, girls and women and girls and boys being 16, 17, 18, they were already married and pregnant and having children at that young age because they had to. Which, obviously, nowadays we consider that, most cultures, I should say, because the world is not uniform, most cultures consider that to be horrible. Oh my God, that's so young. But try and picture that kind of thing happening, and then that really adds another layer to this, because how... let's be honest with ourselves. How mature were you when you were 16? How much of the world did you know when you were 16? How wise, how experienced were you? I can't speak for any of you, of course, but I was an idiot when I was 16. I was a moron, and I have no shame in admitting that. I was a dope. And when I look back at when I was 16 years old, we can go ahead and push it to 18. When I was 18, because I was still just when I was 18. I actually, technically, I had just started finding my ground when I was 17, to be completely honest. But let's just keep the thread going here. When I think back to when I was that young, and how silly and stupid and all the mistakes I made and all the foolishness I was, the thought of being a parent at that age and having to teach my child everything now, because I might die soon, and indeed probably did die within the next couple of years, is a terrifying thought. And so that tradition gets so rote, it becomes such rigid. It's not just rigid, it's simple. Because in order to pass down those kind of traditions over time, it has to be simple. And let's look at FF10 really quick. What are the traditions? Sin. We call it sin because we are sinful, because we deserve it. Pray to the faith. Serve Yevon. Machina bad. Am I missing anything? Because I don't think I am. I just summarized the tenets of the religion and of the society of that entire planet, or indeed continent. There's been some argument on that matter. Right here. And so, and the beautiful irony of this is, it was never intended to be such an evil, such a horrible thing that it is. And when I say evil, I have to qualify that. I call it evil because it's a screwed up situation. It's a situation with no blame. It's a situation with no fault. It's a system that kept going because the system kept going because the system kept going. You understand? And so I can't point to that guy and say, you are a blamer. The situation was evil because of how much it discouraged people from thinking, from feeling, from stretching out, from trying new things, from being creative. And so it was never intended to be this horrible system. It started with good intentions. Granted, there was a war involved, but let's be honest with ourselves. All things considered, we can theoretically theorize that there was a good intent back there when this whole thing started. That there was the intent to help, the intent to make things better. But when you have a system that cycles your generations so fast, and it has to be broken down, you could start with insert piece of work here that you think is the most good thing in the world, right? Obviously that's going to be a relative thing, so I'm not going to name anything specifically. But let's say this pad of paper right here has be awesome and discuss it right here, okay? You know what I mean, right? If that's actually not a good... If this was a whole document about that, in Short we need to do this in these circumstances, and these circumstances need to have this, and always make sure to think about this, blah, blah, blah. Now imagine trying to pass this down to your kids, okay? Let's say you get all of it out. All right, great. You die. They will grow up. They didn't grow up... While they grew up with this, it was not in them as much as it was in their parents, so they try to teach it to their kids. Let's say they miss a point. Just 1 point. It's all they need to miss. And they teach it to their kids. Let's say their kids get it all. Okay, great. We're like 3 generations in now, right? They teach it to their kids. They miss another point. You see where I'm going with this? Now move forward about 1,000 years, and you'll understand why these four tenets, and arguably I was being verbose here, you could argue say there's just two tenets that define the entirety of society, and why it's been broken down so far is because very few people live long enough in order to do anything about it. Think about how old Waka is for a second. Not very old, right? And think about the fact that it's been some time since the previous Sin attack. I don't remember the exact number of years off the top of my head. Think about the fact that his brother died in that Sin attack. Now think about how young his brother was when he went out to die, willingly, knowingly. And how he and Lulu were desperately in love at that time. And everything I'm telling you right now kind of comes into cohesion, doesn't it? What we had in Spira is a spiral of death in which the people who died the most were the children. For all intents and purposes, the young adults, barely existing long enough in order to make the next generation exist at all, and then being wiped out. Sometimes the next generation doesn't get to exist at all either. One of the scenes I remember most powerfully from FF10 was that first Sin attack on, I can't even remember the name of the island, right after Besaid. And they're sending off all the little corpses on the rafts under the ocean, and there's a young woman there who sets off a very small raft. And just prior to when Sin attacks, we saw her playing with her children. That really nails home what FF10 is about, and why I think it is such a great, amazing story, really. Despite all the flaws, despite all the things that I will start going into here in a bit. But I really wanted to get this point across because that is the core of the entire game. And I know several people who don't even think about that, who never even considered it. So let's go ahead and move on here. I'm trying to think. I guess I kind of already covered both of these points. So let's talk about the Tidus thing. Well, let's talk about something else first, actually. A game I used to play, mental exercise, really, which is what I call most thought games, with a friend of mine was, who is the hero of blah? Now, hero, we were defining it as the crucial figure who was who was as close as the setting would allow to be a genuinely good guy or girl, and was the one who, regardless of being the protagonist or the main character, was the one who basically set into motion the solving of the problem, right? A good example, he and I both agreed that Captain Jack Sparrow is actually the hero of the Pirates of the Caribbean trilogy, even though it is arguable that he is not the protagonist of any of the trilogy. So, that kind of a thing is an example of what I'm talking about. Why do I bring this up? Because in FF10, he and I both agreed after some consideration that Jecht is actually the hero of Final Fantasy X. Jecht, I feel regretful because I feel like he didn't get as much characterization as he deserved, but it is good that we kept seeing him after long intervals. We would see the next video of him or the next tale about him, and it would be quite a ways further on from the previous one. And so the somewhat stark character growth Jecht goes through is more understandable when you understand that a lot of time has passed in between each of these points. It's the same as if you haven't seen a relative. You see a relative once a year, and each time you see them, they look so different. You know what I mean? Because it's a year between the last time you saw them. It's the same exact principle. So we see Jecht go from this kind of a layabout, snobbish, arrogant guy to someone who genuinely cares about the situation and the world he's in, to someone who really wishes, he had made up with his son and had been better for his wife, and so many other different things. And he undergoes this plan. He undergoes the decision to become the next Sin, to become the final Aeon, out of sheer ignorance. But in that ignorance, he revealed his true character. He was willing to die to become this Aeon, to save this world that he hadn't even known until he had been plopped onto it by the Faith. And that really spoke a lot towards Jecht and towards his character. Ironically, that is not what we needed in order to save the setting. I'll get to that in a bit. But it is my opinion that in terms of mentality, in terms of mindset, in terms of setting things in motion, Jecht is the hero of Final Fantasy X. Now, well, let's go ahead and get to the topic I've been circling around here, shall we? FF10 starts very much in medias res, or in medias res if you prefer, which is not a thing I mind you. It has to be pulled off in one of two very specific ways. One, the viewer, the person, has to actually be aware of what's going on to at least some extent or another, and so they can basically immediately be like, oh, okay. Or two, they have to have no idea what's going on, and they have to have a surrogate character. I mentioned this way back in the beginning. You need a surrogate character, basically whose entire job from a production standpoint, from a theatrical standpoint, is to be the character that everything is explained to, so that we, the audience, also receive the explanation as the character does. Now, this is a very hard thing to pull off. As I mentioned, it is very difficult to pull off. You need, because what you're doing is more or less literally creating an avatar of the viewer or the player or whatever within the game or the movie or whatever. Now, that means you have to have a personality that is as you have to have a specific personality. I'm actually not going to go into too much detail on that because the what-ifs aren't really important here. FF10 did not do that. FF10 had Tidus. Like I said, I'll get into that in just a bit. But ignoring the problem with Tidus, the surrogate character thing was actually a very good move on their part, in my opinion. Final Fantasy X worked very well as a way of revealing and unveiling the story bit by bit to the player in the same manner that it was being revealed to Tidus. There's a reason that the big twist. Well, actually, I'll talk about that in a minute. But there's a reason that certain elements were not revealed until further on in the game, because nobody ever either nobody ever thought to mention it to Tidus because it's so common that everyone knows it, or Tidus never asked because he's an idiot, or for whatever reason it had just never come into its own. If someone were to pop down in from Star Trek, okay, Star Wars, that's a little bit better, a different setting, a different reality, and was plopped down here into the real world, right into your living room, right there, or your basement, as the case may be, and you pulled them over and you said, okay, would you sit down and then explain everything about how our world works, how our society works, how your society works, wherever you happen to be, whatever country it is, whatever city it is for that matter? Would you sit down and really go into that? No, of course you wouldn't. I mean, you try to give them a basic, some layout, especially if they asked, but going over every little detail is simply infeasible. And that's why it makes so much sense and doesn't feel fake or forced when we have big revelations that are relevant to the story and to the characters later on in the game, because you don't just do this info dump right at the beginning in real life, nor indeed in a work of entertainment. So, that being said, it also allowed for a great deal of pacing, very good pacing actually. As I said, I was about to mention, there's a concept called the hidden twist. Okay, I don't remember what it's actually called, so forgive me. Basically, the idea here is to fake you out. Okay. This is going to be the worst analogy I've ever had, but let's say, okay, here. Okay, I'm drinking from this drink, right? Oh. Now, the first twist, and this usually happens relatively early in the game or movie or whatever, is hang on. There we go. It's a Sonic Cup! Oh my god. Okay. That's the big twist. And everything that we think about this situation has changed because of the fact that we know now this is a Sonic Cup. The second twist that would come on later, now this isn't true because this is actually a limeade in here, but the second twist would be, there's actually amber resin or something within the Sonic Cup. Oh my god, and that changes everything again, right? The idea is to fake you out, to give you the reveal, the twist, because as I've talked about this before, I talked about this with regards to Mass Effect 3, actually. Society nowadays, in terms of entertainment, in terms of the entertainment industry, is so expecting a twist, a reveal, actually, is what it's usually referred to as, that we're waiting for it, and most reveals are less impressive because of the fact that we knew the reveal was coming, because most everything has a reveal. That's why you have the concept of the unreveal, where there is no reveal, and that by itself is generally a more effective twist these days. However, the other way to do it is to have a reveal and then go for quite a ways with everything having been changed and the audience's perspective having been completely altered by that reveal until you reveal the real reveal later on. FF10 does this beautifully. It actually does this like 3 times. Right at the beginning, very, very early on, we learn that Sin is jacked. Now, that's basically all we know. Sin is jacked. We have so little information at that point in time. Keep in mind at this point also we didn't know that Tidus was a dream. We didn't know that he was effectively an Aeon. We didn't know that the Xanarkand he's from is actually modern times. There's been this strong implication that he has gone forward 1,000 years in the future, because especially when we see Xanarkand from the past in that one sphere. Remember? So learning that Jekt is Sin, we have so many implications and so many possibilities, and the mind is just going that whole time. And it's this undercurrent that keeps you thinking the whole game until you start seeing the real reveals about what Tidus really is, about what the final Aeon really is, about what's actually going on with the Church of Yevon. Or is it New Yevon? No, New Yevon is FF10 too, isn't it? So yeah, anyways, all of this worked really well to make it so that the actual reveals, the later ones, had so much more impact because you were primed, you were prepped by that first one. Excellent storytelling, and it wouldn't have worked if, in my opinion, if they hadn't done the player surrogate thing, if they hadn't had Tidus learning the plot twists as we did. You know what I mean? In my opinion, it is always the best type of exposition and of plot twists and reveals. That it is also a exposition or plot twist or reveal to the characters at the same time it is to the audience. You know, it's been said before, the most lazy type of writing is, as you know, this is the basement where I'm talking now. Well, yes, well, as you know, talking about things that they already know. That's just lazy writing. The type of reveal that they did in FF10, beautiful, excellent work. The I keep dancing around this issue because there's so many good things to talk about in this game. I guess I'll just get down to it. I hated Tidus. I couldn't stand him. His voice was irritating. His character is irritating. And yet, this is still technically a positive. Let me continue. Tidus as a player surrogate was an interesting decision because Tidus really is something of a child in terms of personality. He's really that's if I were to describe his personality in one word, it would be childish. And he's arrogant, he's brash, he doesn't think things through, he's emotional, blah 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 blah, right? Now, why do I say that this is still ultimately... I look so weird at this angle. Why is it that I still say ultimately this is a benefit? Jekt was a hero. I said this before, and in my opinion, Jekt was closer to what we would call a standard Final Fantasy hero. But FF10 is not a standard Final Fantasy setting. There is no Zeramus or Kefka to be fought here. There is no Sephiroth threatening the world. There's a system. Sin may be the last boss. Yes, I know Yevon is technically the last boss, but, Sin may be the big threat, but that isn't the problem. The problem is the system. The problem is the cycle. You can't beat a system or a cycle with simple heroism. You need something more. Yes, there are other things they could have done, and I would have preferred it if they had. However, I will have to grudgingly admit that Tidus being a child made perfect sense. He, as a child would, refused. And he absolutely refused to accept the world as he saw it, to accept the cycle, to accept the dreariness, to accept the depression. He kind of went along with it early on, but as the game goes on, you get to see more and more. He's just like, no, no! And he starts dragging other people with him because they see in him something they've never seen before. Jekt was sufficiently humbled by his experiences, ironically, that he deferred to others in his journey. Tidus had no such humility, and as such was proudly himself in a world that was very much not. Tidus and the world of Spira, are worlds apart. But him staying that childish influence, for good and for bad, yes, he's irritating, yes, he's frustrating, but seeing the energy, seeing the jubilation, seeing the emotionalism, seeing the defiance in him is what started kickstarting so many other people, not just the main characters in the party, but NPCs as well. There's a reason that as soon as Tidus shows up, everything starts to change. Everything starts to change. The society starts to change, and it's a slow process, of course, but it did work in the end, and with good reason, in my opinion. Now, as much I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the laughing scene. That could have been done so much better. Anybody who doesn't know what I'm talking about, YouTube Final Fantasy X, Tidus and Yuna laughing. Fake laughing, if you want to be specific. And after about 3 seconds, when you yank your earbuds out and fling them across the room, um, yeah, it's a really bad scene, and it really emphasizes what I don't like about Tidus. And yet, ironically, again, I have to contradict myself because Tidus, I think they could have done it better. But with the way they structured things, Tidus wasn't irritating simply to be irritating, like a certain other character I could come up with. Hope! Hope! Would be. Hope, I'll go ahead and say it outright. Hope was irritating, and it didn't service anything. There was no point to it. There was no purpose there. He was an irritating character, and I wanted to smack him every time I saw him. Tidus was an irritating character in the service of the story, in the service of the plot. Again, I've said this like 5 times. Yes, they could have done it better, but even though he was a frustrating character, and even though he made me want to smack him a few times, he nevertheless did so in service of the story, in the continuation of the plot, and moving everything forward, and so it worked. One of the scenes that hits me most as one of my favorite scenes in the game is actually when he learns the truth that Yuna is about to die, and he starts flipping out like a child would. But it doesn't strike me as irritating, it strikes me as very poignant, very, very potent. Because, again, he is so mad at himself for not realizing it, for not seeing it. He actually says a line, something along the lines of, I've been telling her all this time, all these things we'll do afterwards, Yuna, and we'll go do this later, and we'll go, because I assumed she'd live, and he's so pissed off. And that forms the basis of the latter half of the story, actually. There's that anger and that defiance, and that's the moment where he doesn't grow up. What he does instead is starts channeling his personality into something more productive. That's when he finally absolutely just says, no, I've been iffy about this stuff to now, and I haven't really been with it, but I flat refuse from this point on, no more. Yeah. And it worked. It worked really well. Now let's talk about characters before I get into my finale thing here. Tidus. First one on my list. Stab! No, I don't have much else to say about Tidus. I do find the fact that he is a dream an interesting, a summon, really. An interesting twist that actually makes perfect sense in its own horrible way. The only thing that I wish the game had done more of, and the Ultimania has expanded upon this a little, but mostly this is just theorizing. I've often theorized that the Faith, Jecht, and Auron were very much in league with each other in guiding Tidus towards ending the cycle, right? But for all intents and purposes, that's all conjecture. I wish that had been a little more literal. I wish they had actually said outright every now and again, we've been working with Auron, we've been working with Jecht, we've been trying to end the cycle ever since your father failed, because they brought his father out for good reason, right? That was their first attempt. We'll bring someone from the dream out here and see what happens, and it didn't work. So now we'll try again, right? And but nevertheless, that's the only additional thing I have to say about him. Yuna. Now, this is an interesting topic because, as I said, Jecht is the hero, even though Tidus is most assuredly the protagonist. But I have often said that FF10, perhaps ironically, is Yuna's story, not Tidus's. Tidus certainly has a story here, don't mistake me, but I do find it amusing that one of the taglines for the entire thing is, "This is my story," as said by Tidus, and indeed as emphasized by Auron. And yet at the same time, Tidus, because of his position as a player surrogate, because of his literal position as an outsider, is orbiting the story, if that makes any sense. We've got the story here, right? And it's got all its complexities and whatnot. And he's over here. Now, he is definitely impacting it, make no mistake, as indeed the moon orbiting the Earth does have a very strong impact on it, right? Duh. But, for all intents and purposes, this is the story. And it is Yuna's story that we're going through. Sonic's story. Not Tidus's. We are viewing it through Tidus's eyes, and this is his tale. But it is more Yuna's story than it is him, in my opinion, of course. I've heard this debated both ways many times. I've also heard it debated that it's Auron's story. Shrug. I don't agree with that personally, but moving on. And Yuna, nevertheless, is interesting because I think of Yuna, and I think of Yuna from the end of the game, if that makes any sense. Her from the beginning of the game, just too passive. Now, That being said, I'm sorry, I have to qualify this. Of course she's too passive, because she is a denizen of this world. If she's a denizen of Aspira, she has that mentality that has been ground into her, and grounded to her parents, and grounded to their parents, and grounded to their parents, like I was talking about earlier. So yes, of course Yuna is very passive. She is very... I actually don't have a better word than that. I'm sorry. She kind of goes with things. She kind of lets things happen, and she's always shy about it. She's always, oh, I'm sorry, and that was done on purpose for my understanding of the matter. But the Yuna that I tend to think of when I think of Yuna is the Yuna from the end of the game, where she found her voice, for lack of a better way to put it, and basically has joined with Tidus in saying, no, we're not going to put up with this anymore. We're going to do something better, by God. And when she refuses Unalesca, is just a beautiful scene for her, when she rejects the false hope, as she herself has said it, and casts it aside and says, we're going to find a new hope. Damn it. Then we're going to blow up the Death Star on it. So, I really like the Una character's arc, because it, as much as it is somewhat stilted, it also makes perfect sense. Because the idea is there that it is nature rather than nurture. Now let me explain that really quickly. Obviously, the nurture of the setting is the dreariness, the tradition, the gloom, everything I was talking about earlier, right? Because that's what's always been. But the idea is very strongly there, and this is emphasized in FF10 too, actually, that the nature of the people underneath is essentially the same kind of people that, well, that we are, to be a little bit honest with you, diverse and varied and energetic and ambitious and everything on both ends of the scale, right? And so Yuna, the moment the wool is truly taken off her eyes, all the way up until Unalesca, she was still willing to go with it, even despite Yevon being corrupt, even despite all the things they've been gone through. She was still willing to go and sacrifice her life right up until the moment that the Unalesca stood up there and openly and brazenly said, "I'm sorry, it's all a lie." And it amuses me because Unalesca does not try to deceive her in any way, shape, or form, does not express any ill intent upon her, even. Again, Unalesca is not evil, strictly speaking. She is incredibly misguided, just like all of them were. Like I said, complexity. And so Unalesca tells her that, and at that moment, Yuna realizes, and when I say realizes, I mean truly understands, in her heart, in her core, that this isn't the way things should be. And it is then that she allows herself for the first time to be herself. She realizes who she is, because she has never had the possibility of being herself up until that moment. Up until that moment, and this is true for a lot of the characters, actually. Wakka is another excellent example. Up until that beautiful, beautiful scene, probably one of the best overall scenes in the entire game. And indeed, one of the better scenes in Final Fantasy history in general, I might add. That scene just it's like a lightning bolt. It charges down through the room, and she realizes, no, this is not who I am. This is not what I'm going to be. I am not going to perpetuate a lie. That's wrong. And it is worth noting, I'm sorry, I have to pause for a moment. It is worth noting that several people have wondered, why didn't anybody else have the reaction? Because no one else had Tidus. Now, I'm not saying that Tidus had any particular sway in that scene specifically. It's more the fact that they had been with him this entire time, that they had seen for themselves that there was another way of life. It was presented as a possibility to them. It got their mind going. You know what I mean? And so when the truth came, rather than the dull acceptance that everyone else had, like Yuna's father did, what instead we see is fiery defiance and a refusal. Which is exactly what the plan was, at least I assume. Anyways, Yuna's character is very interesting, and has a very interesting character arc, because it really does have almost no character development, almost no character growth, and it just kind of starts doing this right towards the end there, and it's really awesome, I think, personally. It is also worth noting that, I'm going to go ahead and talk about this here, during the ending, when she finally admits her feelings for Tidus for the first time. And again, even though there is a love story in FF10, I like the fact that it is not actually culminated until the end of the game. Yes, there was the kiss in the waters of the Makalani Woods, or whatever that place was called. But ultimately, it does not truly come into its own until the ending of the game. I've mentioned another game that did that, Final Fantasy VI, between Locke and Celes, which was actually more subtle, and I preferred that. But I do like the fact that a romance was in a game, and a major element of a game, and didn't actually steal the show. Didn't actually even come into the foreplay of the series, except for the one scene, and right at the end, during that heartbreaking scene, where she runs to him, and then she runs through him, because he's already fading. God, what would that be like? Anyways, let's not dwell on that. Let's talk about character growth because, in my opinion, like I said with Yuna, she was kind of like this for the majority of the story. Very low, actually no character growth. To be a little honest about it, we are revealed more things about her character, but she as a character does not actually grow until towards the end of the game. This is true for many of the characters, with one exception. And I've had people look at me like, "What? You're out of your mind," and smack me up the face. Not literally, when I tell them this, but it is in my opinion that the character with the most character growth in Final Fantasy X is Wakka. Seriously, Wakka. Not. This is not a fake out joke. Wakka goes from being one extreme basically to the other. Now, you could argue that's not character growth. I would argue against that. But it is worth noting that Wonka starts off the zealot. He really does. And the worst kind of zealot. The zealot who is a zealot not because he's passionate about it, but because he doesn't know anything else. He doesn't know any better. This is all he knows. The Church of Yevon and the sayings, the priest, he was the hardliner. And yet, while all the other characters kind of go with things or don't really change their outlooks or their perspectives, Wakka is the character that starts voicing confusion the first and starts questioning things first. And props to the actor. I really wish I could think of his name. He's an excellent voice actor. He played Bender on Futurama. He also played Laws in Advent Children. He does a great job with voicing this character who is slowly realizing that he's been wrong all this time. And at the same time, that's a hard thing to take, isn't it? It's easy for us to say, oh yeah, you've been wrong your entire life. Oh well. But to actually think about that for a moment, try and think about that really in your life. Try and think that what you know is wrong. How long do you think it would take you to accept that? Even with the evidence right there, you'd still be denying it, wouldn't you? I mean, obviously not everyone would. Not everyone's the same. But most people, myself included, would be like, no, don't be silly, But as the evidence kept coming, and as the evidence started mounting, he kept questioning it, and that's the important part. That's why I call it character growth in Wakka's case. He actually genuinely starts questioning it, even though he does not change his mind immediately, nor indeed for quite a while. He doesn't actually change his mind for the first time he really changes his mind, from my knowledge, is when he enters Bavel, I think was the name of the place, the Machina City, and he actually makes a comment about it. And there's just this disappointment in his voice because he had been hoping, you could tell the character had been hoping this whole time to have been proven right. To say, oh yeah, okay, it was all a mistake. We're good. No, it wasn't a mistake. Sorry, you were wrong. And but getting back to the point, it wasn't until that moment that he actually started changing his mind, but he was questioning it, and he was thinking about it all the way up until that point, and you could see that in his character. Lulu, who I'm going to cover in brief, was a moderately interesting character at the start who never actually changed that much. We, again, are revealed more facets of her personality, but her personality doesn't actually alter throughout the whole thing. She remains the motherly hen figure who is dedicated more to Yuna than to anything else, and she has her romance problems, which I'm not even going to go into. And that's essentially it. I hate to be unkind to the character, but that is essentially it. And so when the moment comes, the big scene with Yunalesca, Lulu sides with Yuna because Lulu has always sided with Yuna. Period. There's no growth there. Riku has always been someone who has been trying to change things in her own way. And she, like I said, she's been still stuck, just like all the Albed were. They just thought they had an alternative solution to the cycle. But that perspective never actually changes. From day one, that's her mindset basically, all the way up until the point where she is like, yes, I'm with Yuna, and we're totally gonna make this new cycle happen, right? Kimahri, I don't have anything to say about Kimahri. I'm sorry, I have nothing against the character, I really don't. But Kimahri, again, doesn't really change much, or indeed at all, in my opinion, during the story. So that brings us back to Wakka. It takes a different kind of person to say, I have a degree of respect for the character, I guess is what I'm getting to here. It takes a certain kind of man, and I don't mean that to be gender specific. I mean that to be responsible. It takes a certain type of adult. That's the word I want to use. A certain type of responsibility within a person in order to take a look at everything you've believed your entire life and willingly and knowingly toss it aside because you believe it's wrong. That's important. Again, Lulu went that way for Yuna. Kimahri went that way for Yuna. Tidus went that way because he was different. Riku went that way, probably because she, screw Yevon, but, also for Yuna. Wakka rejected Yunalesca and that whole cycle because he believed it was wrong. And I like that. And so it's astonishing that a character like Wakka is one of the most well-developed in my opinion. Now, of course, there's one character I haven't been talking about yet, and that's Auron. Yes, I think Auron's awesome. Absolutely. My goodness, yes. Auron is amazing. One of the things I keep hearing most with regards to Auron is, why didn't he tell them from the beginning? Why didn't he just lay it all out at the beginning? I have this weird impression that Auron actually says why in the game. I don't remember if I'm imagining that or not, to be honest with you. But Auron didn't tell them, and whether it's in the game or not, this is the truth. I'll tell you what. It's not just because of the service of the plot. Obviously we can't reveal everything at the beginning. No. There's an actual in-game, in-lore, in-story reason for this. Who would have believed him? Other than Tidus, of course. Who would have believed him if he had just said, by the way, blah? Who would have listened to him? He kept with them on that whole journey and made sure they got all the way to that last spot because he believed, and in my opinion, he was also working with the Faith and Jecht, but again, moving on. He believed that having seen everything for themselves, and having heard everything for themselves, and having that critical perspective character of Tidus, giving them another, sight into what things are and why, and there's a reason, after all, Auron insisted Tidus come with him in order to accompany Yuna, that they would then make the choice for themselves. The same choice he had already made. Because Auron is inherently a very good person. You can tell that from the way he portrays himself. He accepted the sacrifice of Jecht and of... I suddenly can't think of his name. Yuna's father. Because he, as everyone else, believed it was going to fix things. It was going to help things. It didn't. The cycle continued. And Auron was infuriated by that. And came back and died in his own rage at the situation. And him being an unsent the entire time is actually hinted at very early on. And it's actually really remarkable if you go back and replay the game, and you could see the whole time, Auron, they showed it the whole game. But him being an unsent and keeping going on and not turning into a monster is really important, because very few unsent managed that. And every single one of them that did had a purpose. Had something that was helping to anchor them, to keep them static, to keep them whole. And Auron very much so had it as purpose. Not just to save the world, of course that was very much on the forefront of his mind, but to take care of Tidus, as he'd promised Jecht, to take care of Yuna, as he'd promised What's-His-Face, and to honor the memories of his dead friends. To honor their sacrifice, to make their deaths mean something. Because they didn't, did they? Not really. If FF10 had never happened and the cycle had just kept going after Jecht, their deaths would have been meaningless. Utterly pointless. The spiral of death would have kept going on and on and on. And I'm with Auron on that. No. Hell no. I would have done anything in my power to try and pause that, and indeed he did. So, woo! Auron is an absolutely amazing character. He doesn't have much character growth, unfortunately. Again, we reveal more of his character as we go on, but most of the reason for that is all of his character growth occurred during the previous cycle. And we do see snippets of that. I like that. We do see bits and pieces of his character growth back when he did grow, when he was accompanying Jecht and God, this is like the third time now. Bob! Yuna's father. We do see bits and pieces of that character growth as we go, so that we are revealed more of Auron as he is now as the game goes on. It's not actually character growth, but it serves the same purpose of showing more of the character to us and the path he took, and the place where he is at now and why he is there now, which was an excellent way to approach it, and a very unique perspective on that. Now, let's go ahead and wrap this up really quick. I'm going to talk about Seymour here because I don't know where else to put him. Seymour is a very interesting character to me. Obviously, someone who's screwed up in the head. Obviously, someone who has evil connotations. Obviously, someone who is probably more on the bad side than on the good. However, it is worth noting that at least, very especially in my opinion, and I've agreed with this on many points with many people when discussing this matter, Seymour was not so much evil as he was insane. Now, let me quantify that a bit. Um, Seymour was a character who, and I want to stress this, knew the circumstances around the world, knew exactly what was going on, knew about the spiral of death, knew about all that, and looked at that and said, you know what the best possible solution would be? Killing everybody. Now, that may sound atrocious to you or me, but if you think about the world as I outlined earlier, and you think about the setting, and think about the dreadfulness of it all, doesn't it actually make a degree of sense? For someone who believes so fervently that there is no good way out, as indeed we did find out through through luck and circumstance, would not the best possible way to end the cycle and end the suffering of thousands and thousands of people daily be to end them all? And that was Seymour's whole thing. He wanted to wipe everyone out. And as strange as this sounds, I do find myself sympathizing a bit with the mentality there. I don't agree with it, but that's not really the point. You can see where he's coming from. Now, that being said, they made a couple of really big mistakes with Seymour, in my opinion. First of all, he looks ridiculous. I'm sorry, but Kefka, who is literally dressed as a clown, has more presence and more intimidation factor in his appearance than Seymour does in his bathrobe and his bizarro flexo hair. I'll go with the hair, okay? I know you guys like the weird hair. I'm with it. I like it too sometimes. But his whole appearance was just kind of dull. He looked just like he was trying to be the villain in a soap opera back in the 50s. You know what I mean? And and on top of that is the fact that you also have the worst voice actor possible to play this guy. Seymour, I can't even do the voice. It's. Hang on, let me try. I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't get my voice that high, and I can't get my voice that wispy. He just has this sort of, for lack of a better word, wimp tone to it. He sounds wimpy. He sounds pathetic, you know? Pardon me. It's hard to take a villain like that serious. Listen to, again, I'll use Kefka as the example. Listen to Kefka's voice actor in Dissidia, and tell me that voice isn't intimidating as hell. Tell me that voice doesn't scream crazy and insane and willing to murder you at the drop of a hat, or possibly the raising of a hat. Seymour, by contrast, just kind of sounds like a wuss. And I don't have any better way to put it. I think it was a great disservice to the character because his personality underneath that and his mentality and his mindset actually were really cool. And well written and well designed, but he, oh god, poorly executed. It reminds me of Kuja in many ways, a character who, if you just don't picture it for a moment, okay, don't picture Kuja. Think about Kuja, think about the character, think about his mindset, think about what goes on through his character arcs, and yes, awesome, one of the better villains of the Final Fantasy history. Now add on to that the fact that he's this cross-dressing monkey man. And a lot of that just goes away. I know we're supposed to look past appearances, but guys, this is a form of entertainment. You do appearances for a reason. You deliberate it. You do it with deliberation. You actually go out and say, we're going to make this guy look like a woman. Why? Well, I lost a bet last night, and, you know, do it. Come on, guys, it's not that hard. He doesn't have to look like Golbez, the stereotypical fantasy villain, but he has to look like something, and he has to sound like something, not, oh, I'm Seymour. I'm going to shut up now. So that's all I have to say about Seymour, and I mention him here because FF10 is also very unusual, and indeed, I think it's actually one of the strengths of the game, that there is no true last boss. Yes, there is a final boss, the last fight you have, but for all intents and purposes, you know, there is no Zeromus. There is no Exdeath. There is no Kefka. There is no Sephiroth. You know, there is no, what the heck was her name? Something like Necron. You know, there's no Necron. Although Necron's a little bit debatable. But in all of these instances, the last boss and the villain were synonymous, or at the very least very closely related. Necron's a bit of a wager. I shouldn't have mentioned that. I was actually meaning to mention the Cloud of Darkness. I don't know why I went with Necron. I said her anyways. Moving on. All of these were clearly the villain and clearly the last boss, and it matched and it fit, and there was a relationship there. Having Yevon himself come out of basically nowhere to be the last boss didn't work for me. Having the summons be the last boss prior to that, that made sense. I go with that, and actually that was really perfect, and what was a really good lead-in, and what should have been an epic last boss. Having Sin be the previous last boss, yeah, okay, I'm with that. But one of the things I talk about here is the last dungeon. This is where that weird for weird's sake comes out and cranks it up to 11. I hated the Sin dungeon. I hated going through that place. Everything there was just like a drug trip. And I can't stand that personally, especially when they do that pretty much artificially for no reason. It's never explained. It's never reasoned. It's never outlined. You're just going through drug trip land, and then you fight Jekt, and then you continue the plot. Terrible last dungeon, and if anything, to be a little bit frank, the Omega dungeon would have, in terms of scope, in terms of execution, was a much more feasible last dungeon, in my opinion. It was something that I could actually have seen be the last dungeon instead of Trippy Land. And the last thing I want to talk about here, and I've been saving this for last, very much on purpose, is the music. Final Fantasy X is the first of the Final Fantasy series that Nobuo Uematsu did not primarily do, or indeed entirely do, and that's only partially relevant. I just mentioned it to get an aside, because, as I've said before, Nobuo Uematsu, while he is one of my favorite composers, is not the only good composer in video games, or at Square, for that matter. You know, there are other good composers, and they've other people who've done good things. It doesn't have to be Nobuo Uematsu in order to be amazing. That being said, Final Fantasy X, I do not like the music of this game. There are a few songs I enjoy, but the amount of them that I could count probably amounts to 6, maybe 7 off the top of my head. Most of the ones that Nobuo Uematsu did, I'll admit it. But for example, the Song of the Faith just hurts my ears, and so many of the town songs are just kind of and they don't really fit with the theme of the game, of the dread and the hopelessness. They don't really fit with the pardon me. They don't really fit with the tonality of the areas they're at. They're not really atmospheric like some games have, you know, where the music isn't particularly good in its own right, but at least helps flesh out the atmosphere. It's just kind of awkward and off and doesn't make any sense in virtually every scene. There are some exceptions to that. I don't remember the names of the songs right now, but there are a few exceptions, like the one that plays before the Albed make their big attempt on Sin. That's a good example of the song being used well. But overall, I didn't care for the music, and like I said, I can't really discuss the last boss in detail, which I suppose is the actual last thing I'll talk about here. The Seymour battle song that played for the final Seymour you fight in Sin was excellent, and would have worked as a last boss song. The song for the summon battle was alright. It was acceptable. I would probably call that normal boss if I were to rate it in terms of quality, which is kind of an insult, to be honest. I didn't care for it that much. Oh, God. And so the last boss, I'm sorry, but this has to be discussed. The last boss of the game involves fighting an enemy you basically cannot lose to. I believe it is possible to glitch the game in a way to lose to Yevon, but the fact that you have to work at it in order to make it happen gets the point across. I have said before, on many occasions, for many games, the last boss should be something different. It should be unique, it should be special, extra effort should be put into the last boss, because this is the true climax, the finale of a game. And this is one of the reasons I've always been in favor of 90% of games having a last boss, is because it is such a critical important of an excellent story, especially an interactive story. This is important. So the last boss should be awesome, it should be epic, it should be intimidating, it should be at the very least challenging, or, you know, to some extent or another. Maybe not insanely difficult like the optional stuff, because obviously that belongs over there for the people who want it, but it still should make you work for it. I've often said that Zeromus is probably the ideal last boss in most Final Fantasies, and in fact in any Final Fantasies I've ever played. Zeromus is pretty much what I think of when I think of an RPG last boss. Epic, awesome, incredible music. They did whole new tech for the scene, you know, the background moving and the shifting for the black hole, or I'm sorry, the Big Bang, you know. All of that sort of thing is what a last boss should be. And all of that is what Yevon was not. He was pathetic. He was a little orb thing. Yes, I get it. He's supposed to be an orb thing because he's not a person. It was unimpressive looking. It was unimpressive fighting him. You can't lose. The music was terrible, and you're sitting in trippy land while you're doing it. The whole thing was poorly executed, and ultimately very strangely out of place, because the build-up to the Sin fight was actually pretty excellent. And then the game just kind of drops in quality, in my opinion, all the way through most of the finale. Takes a quick dip up. It's like, all right, we're inside Sin, and it takes this quick spike up when you have the talk between Tidus and Jack. That was pretty cool. Plummets back right down. Fight the Sim. Okay. And then it goes right back up again, because the ending of FF10 was actually quite good, I thought. Rather potent, rather heart tug stringy, it was tear-inducing, and it was good. What happened, guys? I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Because anything else I could say is just reiterating the point. You suck. No, but that's FF10 in a nutshell. Definitely still a good game. Definitely still a game I enjoyed. Just not a game I enjoyed nearly as much as several others. I really lament Final Fantasy X because I do genuinely believe that with the subtlety of it and the complexity of the overall premise and the plot and the setup and the story and everything, that it could have been the Final Fantasy, if you know what I mean. It could have been just epic in every possible way, sense of form. But they just kind of kept tripping over little things, and those little things added up over time, and so we have something that's still an excellent game, still an amazing game, but not a piece of art, in my opinion. And I regret saying that. I admit that freely. And no, I don't think the HD remake is going to change anything, because it's not an actual remake. But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and stop talking now, because my throat hurts. Talk to you guys later. Ah.